I now come to the second of my conversations on the subject of the EU referendum. We are being asked to believe, by those who supposedly represent us, and in this general context will supposedly advise us on what is the best course of action as far as the UK is concerned. I've often argued that in order to become a leading member of a political party, it's necessary to be what I've described as a raging hypocrite. In other words, honest people don't find themselves in the upper echelons of politics in our country. It would be wrong, I hasten to add, to colour every Westminster MP with the same hypocrisy, because that simply wouldn't be true. What I'm saying is that in order to get into a position where you are able or expected to influence others, in other words, in the higher reaches of a political party, you have to be fundamentally dishonest. You can't say what you think. They call it collective responsibility. What they actually mean is that you decide what the public ought to hear, and then you expect all of your members to behave in the manner prescribed. Now, I'm hearing or reading and various other ways of communicating information these days that the out campaign, so to speak, are being asked or expected, or indeed it's being legislated in one shape or form, that they confine, or the cost of the out campaign is limited to £750,000. And I hasten to add that I welcome restrictions in expenditure by our representatives, let's put it that way, as they're only too ready to misspend, misappropriate funds. But that would be a laudable aim, were it not for the fact that it seems to me quite clear that the government itself is putting all its weight, and included in that I put the civil services, behind a campaign to suggest to the public that they should vote in favour of staying in the European community. In other words, we are in no position to trust those elected to supposedly represent us. I've always argued that if you were to take government advice on, let's say, put it this way, if the government said in order to get somewhere, you go out of the gate and turn left, my immediate inclination would be to go out of the gate and turn right. This gives us a very much better chance of getting where we're intending to go. Because government information as such is not information, it's usually propaganda. Indeed, I have no doubt whatsoever that the full armoury of the British establishment is being thrown behind staying in the EU. I hesitate to call it the European Union because there's no union involved. But we're not going to be told that this is what's happening. We're going to hear it suggested to us that problems involved in leaving Europe are insurmountable. Indeed, it will be suggested that the British government and civil services and general infrastructure cannot possibly deal with the very, very complicated problem of deciding to conduct our affairs in a different way. Now, if this is true, this means that what's happening is that it's being suggested that we're incapable of governing ourselves, making our own arrangements insofar as the relationship with the rest of the world is concerned. And if this is true, why, I've often argued, would we bother to elect our government and expect it to further our interests in anything? This doesn't merely apply to the EU, it applies to every day-to-day activity. Furthermore, as indeed I've always believed, the reasons for us doing something or not doing something, whatever it might be in terms of new legislation or organisation or treatment of this section of the community or that, are never real reasons. They are reasons dictated by where the upper reaches or the seniority, the grandees of political parties or governments actually want us to move, the direction in which they want us to move, for their own reasons, not for our benefit. And furthermore, in this general area, I believe that we're also seeing the real nature of the Scottish situation. For example, it's been suggested that were we to vote in favour of leaving the EU and Scotland have a majority in favour of staying, that this would trigger another referendum as to whether or not Scotland should remain part of the United Kingdom. I've no doubt in my mind, incidentally, that the Scottish national position that Scotland's in favour of staying in Europe is a gross arrogance. They've no idea. And as for the majority in Scotland wishing to leave the United Kingdom and get into bed with Germany and France as a preference to England, Ireland and Wales, is an astonishing proposition that I believe won't manifest itself when the referendum, after the referendum has been held. And of course, it remains to be seen whether the Scottish nationals are in fact truly representative of the Scottish people when it comes to more serious questions than a few flag-waving exercises that they've been successful at so far. So I take this opportunity, or I attempt, in my own small way, to suggest to the British people that they take what they hear from David Cameron and the British government, or the supporters of the EU within the British government, they take it with a pinch of salt. We're not going to be presented with the reality, and the reality is clear, as I said in my first conversation. So I suggest that we consider very carefully in the future, indeed as I've argued many times, how we elect people to Westminster, and indeed how our government is constructed. What we have now is serving us badly, both in the context of the European Union and indeed in terms of everyday life. And watching these people engaged in so-called debates is like watching children at play. There is no true dedication to the process. Indeed, the House is usually devoid of all but a few members, those with a conscience, whereas the others have gathered together already before any debate to decide what their point of view is. Now, my understanding of debate is that you may be at the outset in favour of a proposition or against it, but you listen to the arguments and thereafter cast your vote in accordance with those you feel have made the better argument. This is very difficult in the context of the EU because there's not going to be an argument from government. There's going to be, indeed they've made up their minds, that they want us to stay in the EU. And if we wanted any proof of that, we've witnessed David Cameron running around Europe saying to people, well, this is what we want. We're the big, strong government in the UK. This is what we require if we're to remain part of Europe. But by the way, if you refuse to give it to us, we shall be campaigning to stay anyway. It's a farcical bargaining position. And we're being asked to accept it as a serious exercise, followed by, as I've said, a recommendation that we stay in this so-called community when it's clearly going nowhere, when it has no future, and when, if we've got any sense, we'll have set ourselves properly on the path to our future by opting out. So I'll leave it at that and thank you for listening to me, but please, there is no good reason for us to remain within the European Union.